Hi, beautiful humans. Today we're going over chapter 16 of A People's History of the United States. Chapter 16 is titled A People's War. So, as you can see, I'm not in my house. My friend Lena opened up her space to me, and I have like a little office now. That way I don't have to record so early and I can just be out of the apartment while the construction is happening. So I'm very grateful to her. But today we're going to go over part 1 of A People's War. This is a 40-page chapter, and so I think it just makes sense for me to break it up. But basically, this is going to talk about World War II. This is going to talk about the illusion of war being to save other people, when in reality, war is always just a means for profit. So it's just going to be more of the things that you already know. It's just going to be in detail, and it's going to just be within another example. And that example is World War II and the illusion that the United States created for people to believe and rally behind the mission of going to save Jewish people when, as we'll see here, the president didn't actually care. That was not his motivating factor. Sorry to break it to you. We're not surprised though. So anyway, let's get into it. And I don't know what to say anymore. With regard to World War II. Indeed, almost all Americans were now in agreement: capitalists, communists, Democrats, Republicans, poor, rich, and middle class. This was indeed a people's war. Was it? By certain evidence, it was the most popular war the United States had ever fought. Never had a greater proportion of the country participated in a war. 18 million served in the armed forces, 10 million overseas, 25 million workers gave of their pay envelope regularly for war bonds. But could this be considered a manufactured support, since all the power of the nation, not only the government, but the press, the church, and even the chief radical organizations, was behind the calls for all-out war? Was there an undercurrent of reluctance? Were there unpublicized signs of resistance? It was a war against an enemy of unspeakable evil. Hitler's Germany was extending totalitarianism, racism, militarism, and overt aggressive warfare beyond what an already cynical world had experienced. And yet, did the governments conducting this war, England, the United States, the Soviet Union, represent something significantly different, so that the victory would be a blow to imperialism, racism, totalitarianism, militarism in the world? Would the behavior of the United States during the war, in military action abroad, in treatment of minorities at home, be in keeping with a people's war? Would the country's wartime policies respect the rights of the ordinary people everywhere to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? And would post-war America and its policies at home and overseas exemplify the values for which the war was supposed to have been fought? These questions deserve thought. At the time of World War II, the atmosphere was too dense with war fervor to permit them to be aired, which I think makes sense. These are things that we can think about now because we're not in the middle of it, but in the midst of that war being declared and all of the energy that was going on, I don't imagine that people were actually sitting with this, at least not most people. In short, if the entrance of the United States into World War II was, as so many Americans believed at the time observing the Nazi invasions, to defend the principle of non-intervention in the affairs of other countries, the nation's record cast doubt on its ability to uphold that principle. What seemed clear at the time was that the United States was a democracy with certain liberties, while Germany was a dictatorship persecuting its Jewish minority, imprisoning dissidents, whatever their religion, while proclaiming the supremacy of the Nordic race. However, blacks looking at anti-Semitism in Germany might not see their own situation in the US as much different, and the US had done little about Hitler's policies of persecution. Indeed, it had joined England and France in appeasing Hitler throughout the 30s. Roosevelt and his Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, were hesitant to criticize publicly Hitler's anti-Semitic policies when a resolution was introduced in the Senate in January 1934, asking the Senate and the President to express surprise and pain at what the Germans were doing to the Jews and to ask restoration of Jewish rights. The State Department caused this resolution to be buried in committee, according to Arnold Offner. So in the previous video, we were talking about how in the Senate, they were talking about whether the United States would condemn what Hitler was doing to the Jewish population, and they decided that they just wanted to strike that from the record and not even talk about it. So in response to that, Zinn is asking, was this simply poor judgment, an unfortunate error, or was it logical policy of a government whose main interest was not stopping fascism but advancing the imperial interests of the United States? For those interests, in the 30s, an anti-Soviet policy seemed best. Later, when Japan and Germany threatened US world interests, a pro-Soviet and anti-Nazi policy became preferable. Roosevelt was as much concerned to end the oppression of Jews as Lincoln was to end slavery during the Civil War. Their priority in policy was not minority rights, but national power. It was not Hitler's attacks on the Jews that brought the United States into World War II, any more than the enslavement of 4 million blacks brought civil war in 1861, which, if you go back to previous chapters, we dissected that whole thing. It was all about money. It was all about money. What brought the United States fully into the war was the Japanese attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, on December 7th, 1941. Surely it was not the humane concern for Japan's bombing of civilians that led to Roosevelt's outraged call for the war, Japan's attack on China in 1937. Her bombing of civilians in Nanking had not provoked the United States to war. It was the Japanese attack on a link in the American Pacific Empire that did it. So long as Japan remained a well-behaved member of that imperial club of great powers who, in keeping with the open door policy, were sharing the exploitation of China, the US did not object. It had exchanged notes with Japan in 1917 saying the government of the United States recognizes that Japan has special interests in China. In 1928, American consuls in Japan supported the coming of Japanese troops. It was when Japan threatened potential US markets by its attempted takeover of China, but especially as it moved toward the tin, rubber, and oil of Southeast Asia that the United States became alarmed and took those measures which led to the Japanese attack, a total embargo on scrap iron, a total embargo on oil in the summer of 1941. As Bruce Russet says, throughout the 1930s, the United States government had done little to resist the Japanese advance on the Asian continent, but the Southwest Pacific area was of undeniable economic importance to the United States at the time. Most of America's tin and rubber came from there, as did substantial quantities of other raw materials. Pearl Harbor was presented to the American public as a sudden, shocking, immoral act. Immoral it was, like any bombing, but not really sudden or shocking to the American government. Russet says Japan's strike against the American naval base climaxed a long series of mutually antagonistic acts. In initiating economic sanctions against Japan, the United States undertook actions that were widely recognized in Washington as carrying grave risks of war. In August 1941, Roosevelt and Churchill met off the coast of Newfoundland and released to the world the Atlantic Charter, setting forth noble goals for the post-war world, saying their countries seek no aggrandizement, territorial or other, and that they respected the right of all peoples to choose the form of government under which they will live. Which is interesting because remember we just learned about what the policy was in Cuba after they fought for their independence from Spain. Did the United States allow Cuba to form its own government without any kind of influence? The charter was celebrated as declaring the right of nations to self-determination. 2 weeks before the Atlantic Charter, however, the U.S. Acting Secretary of State Sumner Welles had assured the French government that they could keep their empire intact after the end of the war. This government, mindful of its traditional friendship for France, has deeply sympathized with the desire of the French people to maintain their territories and to preserve them intact. Of course, hypocrisy, everything. In late 1942, Roosevelt's personal representative assured French General Henry Giraud, "It is thoroughly understood that the French sovereignty will be reestablished as soon as possible throughout the territory, metropolitan or colonial, over which flew the French flag in 1939. Quietly, behind the headlines in battles and bombings, American diplomats and businessmen worked hard to make sure that when the war ended, American economic power would be second to none in the world. United States business would penetrate areas that up until this time had been dominated by England. The open door policy of equal access would be extended from Asia to Europe, meaning that the United States intended to push England aside and move in. That is what happened to the Middle East and its oil. In August of 1945, a State Department officer said that a review of the diplomatic history of the past 35 years will show that petroleum has historically played a larger part in the external relations of the United States than any other commodity. I think that this is interesting to be reading this from the 1980s in 2024. Roosevelt wrote to Ibn Saud, promising the United States would not change its Palestine policy without consulting the Arabs. In later years, the concern for oil would constantly compete with political concern for the Jewish state in the Middle East, but at this point, oil seemed more important. In other words, there was a time when the US was like, hey, We won't do anything regarding Palestine unless we talk to y'all. And then eventually, as we know, the United States very much so switched up their tune. The poet Archibald MacLeish, then an assistant secretary of state, spoke critically of what he saw in the post-war world. As things are now going, the peace we will make, the peace we seem to be making, will be a piece of oil, a piece of gold, a piece of shipping, a piece, in brief, without moral purpose or human interest. During the war, England and the United States set up the International Monetary Fund to regulate international exchanges of currency. Voting would be proportional to capital contributed, so American dominance would be assured. The International Bank for Reconstruction and Development was set up, supposedly to help reconstruct war-destroyed areas, but one of its first objectives was, in its own words, to promote foreign investment. Averell Harriman, ambassador to Russia, said in early 1944, "Economic assistance is one of the most effective weapons at our disposal to influence European political events in the direction that we desire." The creation of the United Nations during the war was presented to the world as an international cooperation to prevent future wars, but the UN was dominated by the Western imperial countries, the United States, England, and France, and a new imperial power with military bases and powerful influence in Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union. The plight of Jews in German-occupied Europe, which many people thought was at the heart of the war against the Axis, was not a chief concern for Roosevelt. Henry Feingold's research shows that the Jews were being put in camps and the process of annihilation was beginning that would end the horrifying extermination of 6 million Jews and millions of non-Jews. Roosevelt failed to take steps that might have saved thousands of lives. He did not see it as high a priority. He left it to the State Department, and in the State Department, anti-Semitism and a cold bureaucracy became obstacles to action. Was the war being fought to establish that Hitler was wrong in his ideas of white Nordic supremacy over inferior races? The Red Cross, with government approval, separated the blood donations of black and white. It was, ironically, a black physician named Charles Drew who developed the blood bank system. He was put in charge of the wartime donations, and then was fired when he tried to end blood segregation. Despite the urgent need for wartime labor, blacks were still being discriminated against for jobs. A spokesman for a West Coast aviation plant said, "The Negro will be considered only as janitors and in other similar capacities. Regardless of their training as aircraft workers, we will not employ them." Roosevelt never did anything to enforce the orders of the Fair Employment Practices Commissions that he had set up. In other words, it's just hypocrisy. It's just hypocrisy. Like, how could you start a war to go fight for all these things when in your own country you're doing horrible things to people that are considered minorities? So now we're going to talk about how the American government treated Japanese people after the bombing at Pearl Harbor. In one of its policies, the United States came close to direct duplication of fascism. This was in its treatment of the Japanese Americans living on the West Coast. After the Pearl Harbor attack, anti-Japanese hysteria spread in the government. One congressman said, "I'm for catching every Japanese in America, Alaska, and Hawaii now and putting them in concentration camps. Damn them, let's get rid of them." Franklin D. Roosevelt did not share this frenzy, but he calmly signed Executive Order 9066 in February 1942, giving the Army the power, without warrant or indictments or hearings, to arrest every Japanese American on the West Coast. 110,000 men, women, and children, to take them from their homes, transport them to camps far into the interior, and keep them there under prison conditions. 3/4 of these were Nisei, children born in the United States of Japanese parents and therefore American citizens. The other fourth, Issei, born in Japan, were barred by law from becoming citizens. In 1944, the Supreme Court upheld the forced evacuation on the grounds of military necessity. The Japanese remained in those camps for over 3 years. There were strikes, petitions, mass meetings, refusal to sign loyalty oaths, riots against the camp authorities. The Japanese resisted to the end. Not until after the war did the story of the Japanese Americans begin to be known to the general public. The month the war ended in Asia, September 1945, an article appeared in Harper's Magazine by Yale law professor Eugene V. Rostow, calling the Japanese evacuation our worst wartime mistake. Was it a mistake, or was it an action to be expected from a nation with a long history of racism, of which was fighting a war not to end racism, but to retain the fundamental elements of the American system? It was a war waged by a government whose chief beneficiary, despite volumes of reforms, was a wealthy elite. Bruce Catton described the process of industrial mobilization to carry on the war, and how in this process wealth became more and more concentrated in fewer and fewer large corporations. In 1940, the United States had begun sending large amounts of war supplies to England and France. By 1941, 3/4 of the value of military contracts were handled by 56 large corporations. A Senate report, Economic Concentration and World War II, noted that the government contracted for scientific research in industry during the war, and although 2,000 corporations were involved, $1 billion spent, $400 million went to 10 large corporations. Despite the overwhelming atmosphere of patriotism and total dedication to winning the war, despite the no-strike pledges of the AFL and CIO, many of the nation's workers, frustrated by the freezing of their wages while business profits rocketed skyward, went on strike. During the war, there were 14,000 strikes involving 6.7 million workers, more than in any comparable period in American history. In 1944 alone, 1 million workers were on strike in the mines, in the steel mills, in the auto and transportation equipment industries. When the war ended, the strikes continued in record numbers, 3 million on strike in the first half of 1946. There seemed to be widespread indifference, even hostility, on the part of the Negro community to the war, despite the attempts of Negro newspapers and Negro leaders to mobilize Black sentiment. Lawrence Whitner quotes a Black journalist: "The Negro is angry, resentful, and utterly apathetic about the war. Fight for what? He is asking. This war doesn't mean a thing to me. If we win, I lose. So what?" A Black Army officer home on furlough told his friends in Harlem he had been in hundreds of bull sessions with Negro soldiers and found no interest in the war. But there was no organized Negro opposition to the war. In fact, there was little organized opposition from any source. The Communist Party was enthusiastically in support. The Socialist Party was divided, unable to make a clear statement one way or the other. A few small anarchist and pacifist groups refused to back the war. The Women's International League for Peace and Freedom said, "War between nations, or classes, or races cannot permanently settle conflicts or heal the wounds that brought them into being." Only one organized socialist group opposed the war unequivocally. This was the Socialist Workers' Party. The Espionage Act of 1917, still on the books, applied to wartime statements. In 1940, with the United States not yet at war, Congress passed the Smith Act. Okay, this is different. This took Espionage Act prohibitions against talk or writing that would lead to refusal of duty in the armed forces and applied them to peacetime. So that now meant that you could also get in trouble for speaking out against a war even when there was no active war. The Smith Act also made it a crime to advocate the overthrow of the government by force and violence, or to join any group that advocated for this, or to publish anything with such ideas. One might argue that this popular support made it a people's war, but if a people's war means a war of people against attack, a defensive war, if it means a war fought for humane reasons instead of for the privileges of an elite, a war against the few, not the many, then the tactics of all-out aerial assault against the populations of Germany and Japan destroyed this notion. So in the last video, Zinn is basically proposing the question, if this was a people's war to protect people, then the United States and England going and imposing an all-out aerial bombing campaign against civilians basically disproves that, because if they really cared about the people, they wouldn't have just been bombing everything. It says here, the English flew at night with no pretense of aiming at military targets. The Americans flew in the daytime and pretended precision, but bombing from high altitudes made that impossible. The climax of this terror bombing was the bombing of Dresden in early 1945, in which the tremendous heat generated by the bombs created a vacuum into which fire leapt swiftly in a great firestorm through the city. More than 100,000 people died in Dresden. The bombing of Japanese cities continued the strategy of saturation bombing to destroy civilian morale. One nighttime firebombing of Tokyo took 80,000 lives, and then on August 6, 1945, came the lone American plane in the sky over Hiroshima, dropping the first atomic bomb, leaving perhaps 100,000 Japanese people dead, and tens of thousands more slowly dying from radiation poisoning. 12 U.S. Navy flyers in the Hiroshima city jail were killed in the bombing, a fact that the United States government has never officially acknowledged. 3 days later, a second atomic bomb was dropped on the city of Nagasaki, with perhaps 50,000 people killed. As I read this, the first time that I read this, I was like, well, this continues to put things into perspective about what we're seeing right now. We keep talking about all of the people that are passing away and that are being murdered in Palestine, and these are alarming numbers. But when you read this and you realize, oh, one bomb killed 50,000 people. Oh, another bomb killed 100,000 people. Oh, another bomb killed 80,000 people. You start to consider the fact that they know what they're doing. They know what they're doing. The point is that they don't care. It was a very sobering moment to realize that, like, yeah, we keep talking about people that are dying. We keep talking about children that are dying, but they know that already. They've done this before. Japanese leaders had begun talking of a surrender a year before the bombs dropped in Japan. The emperor himself had begun to suggest in June 1945 that alternatives to fighting to the end must be considered. On July 13, Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo wired his ambassador in Moscow, "Unconditional surrender is the only obstacle to peace." Having broken the Japanese code before the war, American intelligence was able to and did relay this message to the president, but it had no effect whatsoever on the efforts to bring the war to a conclusion. In other words, the American government knew that Japan wanted to surrender. They wanted to bring an end to the war. They had been already deciphering the code that they were using to communicate within their own government. This was relayed to the president of the United States at the time, and they still dropped the bombs. So, what does that say? With regard to the previous video, when talking about why didn't the US listen to the fact that the Japanese government wanted to surrender and bring an end to the war instead of dropping the bombs? Was it because too much money and effort had been invested in the atomic bomb not to drop it? General Leslie Groves, head of the Manhattan Project, described Truman as a man on a toboggan, the monument too great to stop it. The dropping of the bomb was the first major operation of the cold diplomatic war with Russia, most anxious to get the Japanese affair over with before the Russians got in. Truman had said, "The world will note that the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, a military base. That was because we wished in this first attack to avoid insofar as possible the killing of civilians." It was a preposterous statement. Those 100,000 killed in Hiroshima were almost all civilians. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were chosen as targets because of their concentration of activities and population. So for him to have said, we dropped it there because we didn't want to kill too many people was a bold-faced lie. It was a bold-faced lie. The dropping of the second bomb on Nagasaki seems to have been scheduled in advance, and no one has ever been able to explain why it was dropped. Because why drop a bomb in Nagasaki when you have already dropped a bomb in Hiroshima just 3 days apart? It doesn't make any fucking sense. It doesn't. It really doesn't. But what about fascism as an idea, as reality? Were its essential elements, militarism, racism, imperialism, now gone? Or were they absorbed into the already poisoned bones of the victors? A.J. Must, the revolutionary pacifist, had predicted in 1941, the problem after a war is with the victor. He thinks he has just proved that war and violence pay. Who will now teach him a lesson? The victors were the Soviet Union and the United States, also England, France, and nationalist China, but they were weak. Both these countries now went to work, without swastikas, goose-stepping, or officially declared racism, but under the cover of socialism on one side and democracy on the other, to carve out their own empires of influence. The war not only put the United States in a position to dominate much of the world, but it created conditions for effective control at home. The unemployment, the economic distress, and the consequent turmoil that had marked the 30s, only partly relieved by New Deal measures, had been pacified, overcome by the greater turmoil of the war. The war brought higher prices for farmers, higher wages, enough prosperity for enough of the population to assume against the rebellions that so threatened the 30s. The war rejuvenated American capitalism. The biggest gains were in corporate profits, which rose from $6.4 billion in 1940 to $10.8 billion in 1944. But enough went to workers and farmers to make them feel the system was doing well for them. It was an old lesson learned by governments that war solves problems of control. No, I don't want to believe that. The United States was trying, in the post-war decade, to create a national consensus, excluding the radicals who could not support a foreign policy aimed at suppressing revolution, of conservatives and liberals, Republicans and Democrats around the policies of Cold War and anti-communism. Such a coalition could be best created by a liberal democratic president whose aggressive policy abroad would be supported by conservatives and whose welfare programs at home would be attractive to liberals. If, in addition, liberals and traditional Democrats could, the memory of the war was still fresh, support a foreign policy against aggression, the radical liberal bloc created by World War II would be broken up. And perhaps if the anti-communist mood became strong enough, liberals could support repressive moves at home, which in ordinary times would be seen as violating the liberal tradition of tolerance. In 1950, there came an event that speeded the formation of the liberal-conservative consensus, Truman's undeclared war in Korea. Korea, occupied by Japan for 35 years, was liberated from Japan after World War II and divided into North Korea, a socialist dictatorship, part of the Soviet sphere of influence, and South Korea, a right-wing dictatorship in the American sphere. There had been threats back and forth between the two Koreas, and when on June 25, 1950, North Korean armies moved southward across the 38th parallel in an invasion of South Korea, the United Nations, dominated by the United States, asked its members to help repel the armed attack. Truman ordered the American armed forces to help South Korea, and the American army became the UN Army. Truman said, "A return to the rule of force in international affairs would have far-reaching effects. The United States will continue to uphold the rule of law." We've talked about the rule of law. Law and order, rule of law, we have talked about that in previous chapters. That is the smoking gun. That is the slogan, the motto, the everything for the United States. Law and order. Perhaps 2 million Koreans, North and South, were killed in the Korean War, all in the name of opposing the rule of force. This is the irony of it all, right? We saw this with Nagasaki, with Hiroshima. Oh, we're doing this because we want to spare other people from dying. We want to lower the number of lives lost. 2 million Koreans, North and South, died. That is an insane number of human beings to be killed for a war that opposed the rule of force. The Korean War mobilized liberal opinion behind the war and the president. It created the kind of coalition that was needed to sustain a policy of intervention abroad, militarization of the economy at home. This meant trouble for those who stayed outside the coalition as radical critics. The left had become very influential in the hard times of the 30s and during the war against fascism. The actual membership of the Communist Party was not large, fewer than 100,000 probably, but it was a potent force in trade unions numbering millions of members who may have been led by the failure of the capitalist system in the 30s to look favorably on communism and socialism. Thus, if the establishment after World War II was to make capitalism more secure in the country and to build a consensus of support for the American empire, it had to weaken and isolate the left. It was Truman's Justice Department that prosecuted the leaders of the Communist Party under the Smith Act, charging them with conspiring to teach and advocate the overthrow of the government by force and violence. The evidence considered mostly of the fact that the communists were distributing Marxist-Leninist literature, which the prosecution contended called for violent revolution. There was certainly not evidence of any immediate danger of violent revolution by the Communist Party. The Supreme Court decision was given by Truman's appointee, Chief Justice Vinson. He stretched the old doctrine of the clear and present danger by saying there was a clear and present conspiracy to make a revolution at some convenient time. And so, the top leadership of the Communist Party was put in prison, and soon after, most of its organizers went underground. Undoubtedly, there was success in the attempt to make the general public fearful of communists and ready to take drastic actions against them. Imprisonment at home, military action abroad. The whole culture was permeated with anti-communism. Even the American Civil Liberties Union, set up specifically to defend the liberties of communists and all other political groups, began to wilt in the Cold War atmosphere. The system, so shaken in the 30s, had learned that war production could bring stability and high profits. Truman's anti-communism was attractive. At the start of 1950, the total U.S. budget was about $40 billion. And the military part of it was about $12 billion. But by 1955, just 5 years later, the military part alone was $40 billion out of a total $62 billion. A small but courageous movement against the military buildup led by War Resisters League and other groups failed to stop it. By 1962, based on a series of invented scares about Soviet military buildups, a false bomber gap, and a false missile gap, the United States had overwhelmingly nuclear superiority. It had the equivalent in nuclear weapons of 1,500 Hiroshima-sized atomic bombs, far more than enough to destroy every major city in the world. The equivalent, in fact, of 10 tons of TNT for every man, woman, and child on earth. Insane. Insane. But the US budget kept mounting, the hysteria kept growing, the profits of corporations getting defense contracts multiplied, and employment and wages moved ahead just enough to keep a substantial number of Americans dependent on war industries for their living. The United States giving economic aid to certain countries was creating a network of American corporate control over the globe and building its political influence over the countries it aided. The Marshall Plan of 1948, which gave $16 billion in economic aid to Western European countries in 4 years, had an economic aim to build up markets for American exports. From 1952 on, foreign aid was more and more obviously designed to build up military power in non-communist countries. In the next 10 years, of the $50 billion in aid granted by the United States to 90 countries, only $5 billion was for non-military economic development. That is... wrap your head around that. Out of $50 billion given in foreign aid in 1952, only $5 billion of that was to help humanity. From military aid, it was a short step to military intervention. In Iran, in 1953, the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, succeeded in overthrowing a government which nationalized the oil industry. In Guatemala, in 1954, a legally elected government was overthrown by an invasion force of mercenaries trained by the CIA at military bases in Honduras and Nicaragua and supported by 4 American fighter planes flown by American pilots. The invasion put into power Colonel Carlos Castillo Armas, who had at one time received military training at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. The government that the United States overthrew was the most democratic Guatemala had ever had. The president, Jacobo Arbenz, was a left-of-center socialist. 4 of the 55 seats in the Congress were held by communists. What was most unsettling to American business interests was that Arbenz had expropriated 234,000 acres of land owned by United Fruit, offering compensation that United Fruit called unacceptable. Armas, in power, gave the land back to United Fruit, abolished the tax on interest and dividends to foreign investors, eliminated the secret ballot, and jailed thousands of political critics. 1958, the Eisenhower government sent thousands of Marines to Lebanon to make sure the pro-American government there was not toppled by a revolution and to keep an armed presence in that oil-rich area. You know this already, though. You know this. This is not surprising. Cuba, DR, Puerto Rico, everywhere, in Asia, in Africa, in the Middle East, in the Caribbean, everywhere. The Democrat-Republican, liberal-conservative agreement to prevent or overthrow revolutionary governments whenever possible, whether communist, socialist, or anti-United Fruit, became most evident in 1961 in Cuba. That little island 90 miles from Florida had gone through a revolution in 1959 by a rebel force led by Fidel Castro, in which the American-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista was overthrown. The revolution was a direct threat to American business interests. Franklin D. Roosevelt's good neighbor policy had repealed the Platt Amendment, but the United States still kept a naval base in Cuba at Guantanamo, and U.S. business interests still dominated the Cuban economy. American companies controlled 80 to 100% of Cuba's utilities, mines, cattle ranches, and oil refineries, 40% of the sugar industry, and 50% of the public railways. Fidel Castro had spent some time in prison after he led an unsuccessful attack in 1953 on an army barracks in Santiago. Out of prison, he went to Mexico, met Argentine revolutionary Che Guevara, and returned in 1956 to Cuba. His tiny force fought guerrilla warfare from the jungles and mountains against Batista's army, drawing more and more popular support, then came out of the mountains and marched across the country into Havana. The Batista government fell apart on New Year's Day, 1959. Disclaimer, I am reading a book, okay? For those of you who feel very strongly about what happened in Cuba, what's happening in Cuba, about Fidel Castro, about communism, don't start going crazy in the comments and arguing with me because I'm not going to respond to you. I'm simply reading what Howard Zinn wrote in this book. In power, Castro moved to set up a nationwide system of education, of housing, of land distribution to the landless peasants. The government confiscated over 1 million acres of land from 3 American companies, including United Fruit. Cuba needed more money to finance its programs, and the United States was not eager to lend it. The IMF, dominated by the US, would not loan money to Cuba because Cuba would not accept its stabilization conditions, which seemed to undermine the revolutionary program that had begun. When Cuba now signed a trade agreement with the Soviet Union, American-owned oil companies in Cuba refused to refine crude oil that came from the Soviet Union. Castro seized these companies. The United States cut down on its sugar buying from Cuba, on which Cuba's economy depended, and the Soviet Union immediately agreed to buy all the 700,000 tons of sugar that the United States would not buy. Cuba had changed. The good neighbor policy did not apply. In the spring of 1960, President Eisenhower secretly authorized the CIA to arm and train anti-Castro Cuban exiles in Guatemala for a future invasion of Cuba. When Kennedy took office in the spring of 1961, the CIA had 1,400 exiles armed and trained. He moved ahead with the plans, and on April 17, 1961, the CIA-trained force, with some Americans participating, landed at the Bay of Pigs on the south shore of Cuba, 90 miles from Havana. They expected to stimulate a general rising against Castro, but it was a popular regime. There was no rising, and in 3 days the CIA forces were crushed by Castro's army. The whole of Bay of Pigs affair was accompanied by hypocrisy and lying. The invasion was a violation, recalling Truman's rule of law, of a treaty the United States had signed, the Charter of the Organization of American States, which reads, "No state or group of states has the right to intervene directly or indirectly for any reason whatever in the internal or external affairs of any other state." 4 days before the invasion, because there had been press reports of secret bases and CIA training for invaders, President Kennedy told a press conference, "There will not be, under any conditions, any intervention in Cuba by the United States Armed Forces." True, the landing force was Cuban, but it was all organized by the United States and American warplanes, including American pilots, who were involved. Kennedy approved the use of unmarked Navy jets for the invasion. 4 American pilots of those planes were killed, and their families were not told the truth about how those men died. The US was dependent on permanent war economy. It had big pockets of poverty, but there were enough people at work making enough money to keep things quiet. Remember, we always talk about rebellion is right around the corner. Rebellion's right around the corner. Really, the answer to quelling rebellion is that enough people need to be content in order for them to not join any kind of rumblings of revolutionary activity. And so that's what was happening here. The distribution of wealth was still unequal. From 1944 to 1961, it had not changed much. The lowest fifth of the families received 5% of all income. The highest fifth received 45% of all the income. In 1953, 1.6% of the adult population owned more than 80% of the corporate stock and nearly 90% of the corporate bonds. When John F. Kennedy presented his budget to the nation after his first year in office, it was clear that, liberal Democrat or not, there would be no major change in the distribution of income or wealth or tax advantages. This is the final video for chapter 16. We're gonna end it here. The country seemed under control, and then, in the 1960s, came a series of explosive rebellions in every area of American life, which showed that all the system's estimates of security and success were wrong. What we're going to get into in chapter 17 is the Black Revolt of the 1950s and 60s, the North and South. We're going to start talking about Malcolm X. We're going to talk about Martin Luther King. We're going to talk about Huey Newton. We're going to talk about the Black Panthers. Let me know what y'all think. We are 442 pages into this book, and by now, I understand the parallels that Howard Zinn is trying to draw within every single stage of American development, that really everything comes down to money. It comes down to money, exclusion, privileges, the American government and the systems that be really becoming genius and cunning with their methods of control and violence. As I was reading this, it clicked for me that even right now, I think there was a bill that just passed about a mandatory draft for 18 to 26-year-old men in the United States. Don't quote me. I don't know if it's like went through the Congress and it's going to the Senate. I don't know, but I'm seeing some videos about it on TikTok and I'm like, oh yeah, this is just like the laws that happened in the past. The conscriptions, all of that. The more things change, the more things stay the same. And that is why I'm so passionate about us embracing radical imagination and really coming together to imagine a new world, new methods, new philosophies, new everything. Their tactics update, but they also don't. They modify a little bit, but the through line will always be military and violence. So how do we circumvent that? It's going to require us to think big. It's going to require us to think differently. It's going to require us to lean into each other, into our spiritual practices, into everything. Into everything. Yeah. I have faith, though. I have faith. I'm reading all of this, and this is all shit. But I still have faith. there has to be something else. I don't know what it is, but that's why I'm so hungry for like new philosophies and new theories and new all of that will reflect the present moment, because there are some things from the past that were from that time period and certain approaches that were from that time period that were relevant then, and we can draw inspiration from it now, but we need something that makes sense for right now, given all of the factors that we are all facing right now. Anyway, I hope that y'all enjoyed that chapter. I'm going to get into chapter 17 tomorrow morning. I'm going to wake up early because I just want to knock these out, but I'm going to go edit these videos, wind down for this evening, and possibly begin reading chapter 18. Yeah, okay, that's it.